Hello, everyone, and I'm Roy Crooks again, and I'm really excited about this particular study. So, what I'm going to do is a review of Andrew Wilson's book, Scribal Habits in Greek New Testament Manuscripts, and some great stuff in there, and hopefully, I will do it justice. Yeah. Okay, let's go into it. So, what you find is that one text of criticism relies on a number of rules or canons. Um, Jacob Griesbach in the 18th century set about 15 rules. One of them was a shorter reading and harder reading, harsher reading. And so no actual uh, studies were done till E.C. Cowell in 1965, the 20th century. So Andrew Wilson, now in the paper he did before from an essay, Digging for the Truth, you can download it from the internet. And it's out of print now, but you can still download it from the internet. Great stuff. And he said two problems arise from the way in which these early textual critics allowed the debate over the TR to shape the transcriptional canons, one methodological and one logical. So, firstly, the process of determining scribal habits was ill-defined and thus methodologically far from satisfactory. Each textual critics did not draw up clearly formulated principles or to detect scribal errors, nor did they publish comprehensive lists of variant readings which established patterns of scribal corruption. Now, what does that mean, really? Is that how they really worked was that the text scriptures represent the Byzantine texts, right? And therefore, the older manuscripts, your Vaticanus Sinaiticus, were considerably shorter than the TR or the Byzantine type text types. And because the TR was seen as corrupted because it represented a Byzantine text, um, so therefore, the assumption was that the corrupted text, scribes more likely added than took away. So hence, that's how a lot of canons were developed. So whatever the TR wasn't, um, because it was corrupted, that's what was adopted as a canon, so to speak. And that's probably been oversimplistic, but that's basically there was no methodology to establish how people arrive at the canons. And one of the things I've said before is like when I was at school, it wasn't just getting the answer right, but how did you arrive at the answer? So, say 300 years, we never had any methodology. Griesenbach never set down how we arrived at these canons or these rules. But textual critics, modern textual critics, continue to make decisions on variant readings based on these rules without actually testing them, whether they be so or not. So, brief history. Since the 18th century, shorter reading canon has played a significant role. And you just have to look at Bruce Metzger's technical commentary, specifically in shaping the field of New Testament criticism. So Westcott, Hort, Alan, Metzger, right up to this day, up to Houghton, their influence textual scholars in terms of the shortened reading to be preferred. But it wasn't until about 1965, I think E.C. Cowell introduced a methodology approach for studying scribal behavior through the analysis of singular readings. This later became foundation for subsequent scholars such as Royce. James Royce really uh, meet to the bones of E.C. Cowell's methodology of scribal habits. Juan Hernandez then took on the baton from Royce when he looked to use the same principle or same methodology when looking at the codices in the Apocalypse, right? And then you've got Peter Head, Paulson, I think he used Matthew's Gospel. Uh, Dr. Maurice Robinson, he actually used it for his doctoral dissertation, and obviously Andrew Wilson. And there was a number of people, Elijah Hickson, Peter Guri, quite a number of people used the single reading principle. Right, so James Royce, he adopted Cowell's single reading method to investigate 6 manuscripts. 3 were already studied by Cowell, but with Cowell, didn't actually come to any conclusions, i.e., shorter reading, harsher reading, etc. And what he did, he looked at 6 of the earliest papyri. And as he said, to help textualists move beyond long held but unsubstantiated beliefs. So his work, I don't think it can be estimated the impact that his work did, his monumental work upstairs somewhere. But the typical errors that scribes made, the tone was set on the very first page. In fact, the first, when you read Royce's book, especially the first, it's worth the money alone, just the first, just the introduction, and with various assertions concerning the copying habits of scribes. Right. So what he did, I said, he really put the meat on the bones for the singular reading methodology. So as the method, he refined Howell's screening process to singular by expanding the search beyond Tischendorf's eighth edition and to include other critical apparatus. The von Soden, massive work there. Clark, Nessel's 25th, 26th, and 27th. UBS, third and fourth edition. Alan's Synopsis, Legg, the International Greek New Testament Project, which I think was dealing with Luke, and Ruben Swanson as well. Um, so that's what he identified about in terms of singular cross references. But the interesting point, and which I've just sort of learned, is a man called Alphonse Dane, right? So Wilson takes his starting point not with something with Cowell, and it's a study that's not really known. He said some mistakes, and this was Alphonse Dane, 1949. So some mistakes are more common than the others. This is what he said. There are at least two that all copyists, without exception, frequently commit. The first is the omission of small words, short terms, especially those small words that can constitute the utilities of the sentence, connectives, conjunctions, participles, prepositions. And they had a amazing tendency to disappear under the pen of copyists, at least when it came to ancient language. The verb to be, and as hard as it may be to believe, negations are no exception to this rule. In the Manuscripts tradition, Flair's text, I've noted the disappearance of approximately 800 small words. So, this was done in 1949. Everything this man, Alfonso Dane, said was true. Right, so let's look in terms of studies on page 18 of his book. He looks at studies which followed singular readings. So Powell didn't really come to any conclusion about the shorter reading or in the textual canons, but Royce, he really focused on the shorter reading, right? So then you had Robinson, you had Head, Hernandez, um, Yonkind, I think he just did Sinaiticus. Paulson did Matthew and he did the main codices, you know, Codex Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, I think Ephraim, Beza, I think five main ones. So it was very useful one, his Paulson's one. So I've added all that up, and the average is 63% to 37. What you find with the individual studies, normally 60, 40, around about that. So what we're going to look at next is alternative methodologies to uh, Royce's singular readings, and actually some which actually criticize Royce's methodology. Let's look at that. So Bojo, they looked at Papyri 46, but what they did, Bojo and Moises Silva compared it against the Nestor-Zeland. Now, one of the issues with the Nestor-Zeland, it already prefers the shorter reading. So we would expect to see more additions than omissions, but we don't see that. So if you notice, Bojo 431 omissions, 148 additions. And so you see here that scribes, even using different methodology from Royce's singular readings, you find that scribes more like to omit and add. Now, interesting, Elijah Hickson, I remember having a debate with somebody, I won't say argument, debate with somebody on Facebook. And one of the things that was said, well, Hickson's study throws out Royce's singular variant readings methodology. Now, if what you notice with Hickson, he has three studies. So one, he viewed the same one, singular readings, and you can see 21 to 7. It's quite a small number anyway. What you will notice is quite a small number. Then he did another methodology where he used the three purple codices, and those are three purple codices. And what he did, he created an exemplar from those and then identified readings. And even then, even though it's very close, there was more omissions than additions. And then he did another one with family readings. And this is only one which had more additions than omissions. But I can't really go into it at the moment in terms of, but he did three studies. Two out of the three studies said scribes omitted more than they added. We've got Farnes' study. What Farnes did, he used an exemplar with actual copies. Now, these were later manuscripts. And one of the reasons why you notice the numbers are so low is that scribes were more meticulous with later manuscripts. They were better copied than perhaps the papyri and the early codices, hence a small number, very few single readings. Peter Guri, he used the same methodology, scribes omitted more they added, and then he did the agreements against the CBGM, coherence-based genealogical method, and it still demonstrated more omissions than additions. So you will notice here that even though they use different methodology, they still come to the point of scribes more likely to omit rather than add. So one of the things I will also point out in the book, in the context page, he spends 61 pages responding to studies opposing the singular reading. 61 pages. He looks at each one of those and dissects them and goes into it. Brilliant stuff. So he didn't just sort of bypass it. He went into it. Yeah. Interesting facts. Right. That even when, and not with observation, even when, and this is what Barbara Land said before, he was complaining against the single rated methodology by Royce. And says, well, why don't you compare it against the Nestle Land? And what they found, the scribes, the figure actually went up. The difference went up. Some cases 70 to 75%. So even against a Nestle Land text, a critical literature that tends to favor thought readings, the rate for detected omission is in fact higher and studies employing Cowell's singular reading methodology. So as I said before, with Cowell's and those who followed that, it's only 60-40 around about there. When they compared to Nestle Land, it went to 70-75% with some of the readings, some of the scribe perhaps studies. But the reality is, in fact, all studies demonstrate of a scribe's tendency to omit rather than add. Page 80, Andrew Wilson of the book. One of the most obvious lacunae in New Testament textual critical research, we do not have any empirical, this is one of the things I've been saying for a while now, we do not have any empirical basis for the traditional transcriptional canons. Nearly 300 years after the first formulation, without such evidence, how we distinguish fact from folklore? I couldn't put it better myself. It's got a wayward word Andrew has. Without statistical verification, how is it possible to speak of transcriptional probability? Seeing probabilities can only be determined mathematically. There remains a need either to verify the canons or to show they're invalid. Now, this is one of the things what you will notice is that, especially when you read Bruce Metzger's commentaries, I'm going to go into that a bit later, is that there's no references to empirical studies. How did those canons appear? How did Griesbach develop those canons? There should have been something laid down, just like what Howell laid down for Royce. Royce laid down for subsequent scholars like Maurice Robinson, Juan Hernandez, Peter Head, Dirk Jonkin, Andrew Wilson. He laid down a clear path, a clear plan how to analyze it, and many people took that on board. And the beauty of it is that methodology can be used at any time with Papyri, Miniscules, Majiscules, or Lectionaries. So, for 300 years, the discipline has assumed that scribes expanded the text, and this study, so basically, Andrew Wilson's study he looked at 10,000 scribal errors, both singular and sub-singular readings. This is the largest study ever done on scribal habits, the largest by far. Right? So it calls into assumption to question and conclude that canon itself is false and that consequences for the text of the Greek New Testament are profound. Right? So you just have a cursory look through Bruce Metzger's textual commentary and you will see a difference for the shorter reading. And it's actually interesting thing when you read the textual commentary by Metzger, he's quite explicit about the shorter reading. Kurt and Barbara Land in their book Text and New Testament and Metzger, it's all about the shorter reading. It's interesting that Houghton's textual commentary is not explicit about the internal evidence. He doesn't actually mention the shorter reading, right, in terms of his the introduction part. So let's go on here. All right. So it's the greatest so far in terms of studying scribal habits we've ever had. 10,000 scribal errors, largest one. And we'll see that it goes right from the papyri right through to the lectionaries. It's never been done before. So the advantage of water study. One, you use a substantially larger data set, both in terms of variant readings examined and the extended chronological range it covers. So if you look where you find most studies in Scribal Habits, they do, for example, Dirk Jonkin looked at Sinaiticus. Royce only looked at the six papyri. Um, I think Maurice Robinson, I think he was fairly varied. Juan Hernandez looked at the codices. Paulson looked at the codices, the early codices. But this one looks at the papyri, the Majiscules, the large letter, Miniscules, small letter, and also the lectionaries. So not only is a broad range with the type, but also not just a broad range, also in terms of time, right from the earliest papyri we have, in terms of central papyri, right through before the time of printing. So it's never been done before. So what I've done a little graph, drawn that from page 93. When you get the book, is you'll see a consistent emissions compared to editions. So whether you go to the papyri, earliest papyri, the majuscules, the minuscules, or the lectionaries, it's consistent. The fact that scribes are more likely to omit than add. Also, the emissions variant, that's on page 93 of the book. When you look at the gospel, it declines. The number of emissions variants reduces dramatically once you get past the book of Acts. All right. So it's based off a shorter reading. There are a number of places that would most likely need revision towards a longer reading. Now, this is not a minor adjustment. I mean, there's quite a number. I remember I put something through Copilot where the number of times they deferred to the shorter reading, it's quite a large amount. I can't think of the figures off the top of my head, but quite a large amount. So it needs a massive revision. So the NA29's come out, the United Bible Society 6 has come out, we've had CBGM, but they haven't taken into account all those studies, the plethora of studies into scribal habits, and all saying the same thing, that scribes are more likely to omit than add. Implies a global recalibration of transcriptional probabilities, impact a number of textual decisions across the New Testament where the shorter reading was preferred. So it needs to be revamped, yeah. Right. And we also have to consider, and this is one of the things one interesting. So when you look at Houghton's textual commentary of how they made decisions, when you look at the bibliography, that's from page 569 to 590, regarding studies on scribal habits, only Dirk Jonkin's 2000 work, single readings in Sinaiticus. So the major studies in scribal habits in terms of amongst the scholarly elite is Royce's. That's a standard work. It's like if you talk about modern textual criticism, your two standard works are Bruce Metzger's Text of the New Testament, the transmission, the corruption, and the restoration. That's a standard work. Kurt and Barbara Land's Text of the New Testament, that's a standard work. In Scribal Habits, the standard work is James Royce's work. And now this one with Andrew Wilson. Andrew Wilson. But none of those are referred to. An interesting thing, when I looked in the bibliography, Juan Hernandez is referred not in Scribal Habits. For me, his larger work is the study of Scribal Habits of the Apocalypse. But his work about the Homoion, which in terms of modern textual criticism, they don't recognize that. So why refer to that when he's done a major study on scribal habits? Elijah Hickson, he's done 3 types of study of scribal habits. He's not referred to in terms of scribal habits. He's referred to in the book, in the bibliography, but not to scribal habits. Maurice Robinson, he's referred to, but regarding his Greek New Testament, but no reference to his study of scribal habits, right? So Bruce Metzger, in his textual commentary, the 2 editions, he makes no reference to in the textual commentary any study of scribal habits. And how long will this go on for? How long will this go on for? Because, to ignore all these studies in scribal habits and still make decisions based on canons that have not been proved is disingenuous. Conclusion of the matter. For more than 2 centuries, New Testament text criticism has relied on the shorter reading, all right? Assuming that scribes were more inclined to add than to omit, and that shorter readings therefore preserve the original text. Extensive empirical research into scribal habits now shows this assumption to be wrong. So remember I said before, I've shown you the two studies. One use Royce's single readings and Carroll's single readings, and the others using other methodology. They all say the same thing. Scribes are more likely to omit than add. And even going back to 1949 with Alfonso Dane, he told us it years ago. But let's go on. So all the canons will actually come into question because they've never been proved. Now, the thing about with Wilson's study is that across manuscripts, periods, textual traditions, scribes demonstrably omit more often than they added, producing texts that are shorter, harsher, and less harmonized by default. Because modern text editions have persistently preferred such short readings, the Greek New Testament has been systematically shortened at numerous points and is, in meaningful respects, too brief. The traditional shorter reading canon can no longer be functioning as a reliable principle of transcriptional probability. This is the challenge. Textual criticism must therefore recalibrate its canons on the basis of documented scribal behavior, abandon automatic preference for brevity, and reassess longer readings without prejudice. Now, one of the things I said with Andrew Wilson's study, he doesn't just focus on shorter readings, he looks at harder readings, harsher readings. So he goes into all that as well. So I'd like to leave with a challenge. The cumulative evidence from recent empirical studies of scribal habits presents a significant and avoidable challenge to modern New Testament textual criticism, particularly as embodied in the current Nestle's Land, that's the 29, and United Bible Society 6. At the center of the challenge lies the consistent and cross-validated findings that scribes tend to omit rather than add to the text, often at rates approaching 70-75% in some studies. And those studies were primarily where they compared against the Nestle's Land, and really falling below a normal majority, even under alternative methodologies. Now, here we come to the point. The central question is no longer whether scribes sometimes had added to the text, but whether the modern critical tradition has underestimated the extent to which they omitted from it. And with that comes a decisive challenge. Here's a challenge. Will text criticism continue to rely on traditional canons, or will it allow the data to reshape the text it seeks to recover? That's a challenge. That is a challenge. The question is, will modern text critics take up that challenge and work according to empirical evidence? Well, I really enjoyed doing this video. God bless you. God keep you. May good face shine upon you. And I pray that whoever reads, that whoever sees this and listens to it, they will take on that challenge. Take care.